Hi, Misha here, and one of the earliest Star Wars videos I did was looking at walkers and what have you, and I felt like revisiting today, years on, and I wanted to look at the ground vehicles from very small and light to very large, used by the Grand Army of the Republic during the Clone Wars, primarily piloted by the clones themselves. And I even brought out the De Agostini models for you today. I don't bring these out a lot just because they're kind of in a shelf and I have to open them up to see what's inside because, well, I can't look inside. But they are neat little, inexpensive, yet quite highly detailed models, complete with cases and even some artwork and magazines. They're really neat when they're around 20-25 bucks. On top of that, we also have several examples from the Titanium series, the original one. I believe these are all the old Titanium. I don't believe there's any Black Series Titanium. And there's a decent amount of overlap, but there are some that D'Agostini made that the Titanium didn't, and vice versa. So with no further ado, let's go back to 22 BBY, the Battle of Geonosis, and the beginning of the Clone Wars. One day I'll actually get a real spinny thing for models, but this cake thing has served so well for so long, and it was like $5. One thing, being serious, that I've run into is a lot of the model spinny things are motorized, but you can't spin them manually, and in my position you might imagine having something that moves on its own isn't the most desirable. I digress. Let's begin with the BARC, the Bike Advanced Recon Commando Speeder. This is from De Agostini. And these models are really nice. I do wish they had people in them. It doesn't really matter on the small scale ones, but you really notice it on the larger scale because it's just empty. But that's what they did. And again, they were going more for a true part work kind of model thing. And I've liked a lot of the stuff De Agostini has done. I one day want to talk to you about some of their Japanese military craft, but not today. The BARC Speeder, pretty famous in the Clone War. I thought about bringing it out, but before this there was the 74Z Speeder, i.e., yes, that one that we see in Return of the Jedi. Kind of interesting that the 74Z is in service before and after this version, which is more modern, but it's kind of how it goes. Both were designed by Aerotech. They're both, well, this is a repulsor craft with a turbofan type engine in the front, and it does resemble in a lot of ways the early 74Z. It was meant to be an homage. We first see it in Revenge of the Sith, but we also see it later, chronologically earlier in Clone Wars. So even if it wasn't in service at the beginning of the war in 22 BBY, we know it was around by 21. It was originally made for the ARC troopers, but it was so successful, so useful, that it ended up being much more of a general use. It was designed for scouting, reconnaissance, patrol, kind of cavalry, support, what have you. It was very fast. Overall length was about 4.6 meters and just under 1.3 meters wide. Top speed was over 500 kilometers per hour, so almost as fast as some vessels in Star Wars. And it actually had a very high altitude for being a repulsor craft, a speeder. So much so that sometimes these would come up from the ground and escort lot gunships down to a planet. Had a standard crew of one pilot. In a pinch, one passenger could also be fitted on board. Really didn't have any cargo ability in and of itself, a couple of kilos. no supplies for duration. Although sidecars or a stretcher for a wounded could be attached, improving things because they did have a bit of power. It was relatively well armed for its size. It had 2 blasters in the front, and it had 2 light lasers mounted towards the rear, so a total of 4 guns. And yeah, it was just meant to zip around, and by obvious things required quite a bit of skill because of the speed. We see these also used by police on Coruscant, and there is a civilian version of this, but it was primarily a military craft. It has 2 control vanes with 2 control sticks, and also pedals. Again, very much like the 74Z speeder. We definitely see these a lot towards the end of the Clone Wars, places like Kashyyyk, where a lot of them were actually left behind after the war. And they would continue on in the Empire briefly, but for whatever reason the Empire would retire them. Of course, the real world explanation is this model didn't exist during the original series, but it is really neat. Very skeletal, but still a little more beefed up than the speeder from Return of the Jedi. So what do you think? Now, let's look at its big brother. We go from one only in De Agostini to one only in the titanium. This is the ISP, Infantry Support Platform, but more commonly known as the Swamp Speeder. And this might not look like a bark at first glance, but it's actually built kind of on the same chassis. Nominally still designed by Aerotech, really the customization work and kind of making it a heavier thing was done by a different company, Ulashaw, and both companies would make these. Now this would come later on in the Clone Wars, around 20, maybe even early 19 BBY, and the first major use was in the Battle of Kashyyyk. We would also see them during the Outer Rim sieges like Felucia. And unlike the bark speeder, this would actually continue on in the Empire for quite some time. And it is just a heavier version. But whereas the bark was meant for escorting some vessels and scouting and reconnaissance, this was meant for close support of infantry and basically taking down enemy light armor. And to that end, it is more heavily armed. What do we have here? Well, it's a little bit longer at about 5 meters, but it's quite a bit wider. It still has repulsors and a turbofan, but it is slower at about 100 clicks on average. It has a standard crew of 2 clones, no passenger facilities. It can carry about 50 kilograms in cargo and does have enough stores for a day or two, food, water, so it can go out in the field a little longer than a bark. It has 2 twin light lasers, and they are turreted, and they do move on this model / toy. These are all die-cast, by the way. Kind of neat. The guns are rubbery, the main body, except for the figures inside it's all metal. So the idea was it would come in and support clones on the ground. No shielding, of course, a little bit of armor for the guys inside, but mostly relying on speed. Another major thing was it could go over unstable terrain quite well because it was a repulsor craft. Even though ISP was its official name, Swamp Speeder was quickly what it was nicknamed because it was found to be very useful in muddy, swampy, wet terrain because it could just glide over them, marshes, what have you, in plenty of places. And that really was where it found its role in the Empire. A lot of them were in the red and white scheme, but increasingly a lot of them would get kind of a green paint scheme just because of camouflage. But yeah, this is basically the same general technology and basic frame underneath is a bark, just expanded out, made heavier, hence slower. But it is meant to be more of a mobile gun platform. So basically, a couple of heavy weapons that could move around a battlefield and provide some support. So those are repulsor craft. What about walkers? Kuwats, AT-RT, all-terrain reconnaissance transport. Okay, let's just admit this right out of the way. In reality, this would be pretty silly. But in universe, it's basically a mechanical horse, which is pretty cool. We'll start off with one from D'Agostini here. This was basically a personal walker. It only held one person, that was it. No real capacity for passenger or crew. Although it could carry about 100 kilos in supplies, cargo, what have you, which gave it a couple of days duration in the field if necessary. So what did it give the guy? Well, for one, it put him up about 3.5 meters tall. So that could be beneficial in some areas. These legs were well segmented, well articulated, which gave it good maneuverability and able to climb good slopes. It also had a top speed of about 75 clicks, so pretty fast for a walker. He also had advanced comm array. You can see in the back here the antenna. He also had a sensor package, better than what his suit, his armor would give him. And of course, we do have a relatively large laser cannon in front. This was the standard cannon, but it was somewhat modular in the field. It was often pulled off and replaced with, say, a Z6 rotary blaster or even a flamethrower or something else. A lot of field adaptations, what have you. These were light. They could be packed on mini transports or several on things like a gunship. And being on the ground like this did give some advantages over speeders. And again, you got to admit, probably they just looked cool. And that's okay, because we're still in fiction. But they would serve throughout the Clone Wars. And they would actually be used for several roles. And here is an example from the titanium. It's actually very heavy. The whole thing is solid metal. Only the little dude is plastic. Also the antenna and also the gun. I have a couple of these. This one's a little bit bent, being used hot water. In addition to the main gun, there is also a mortar launcher that could be featured on these, kind of below it, like light grenades basically, giving them a little bit better firepower, and they were typically trained scouts for these. Of course, that's reconnaissance was their first role, sometimes patrol, infantry support, they kind of acting as light cavalry, because they were relatively fast, faster than a man on foot anyway. They were also used for battlefield cleanup, support, kind of aftermath. And they were used for occupying areas, cities, occupation forces. And some were even used by police forces, which you could actually understand why this would be useful for a police officer. And again, the long comms array and the faster speed would come in handy there too. But they afforded basically no protection for the guy. If anything, they made him a bigger target as he's standing over 3 meters tall. By the way, it's about 3 meters wide as well. but very Star Wars, and it's kind of our smallest, lightest of our AT craft. So, seemed like a good place to begin here. And our next one is quite similar. Designed by Rothana Heavy Engineering, the AT-PT, All-Terrain Personal Transport. Basically, it's a mech. And I have a soft spot for this one, maybe because the AT-PT first appeared way back in Timothy Zahn's first trilogy. I think it was in the second book. So it was part of Legends. Luckily, it has been made canon in various source books since 2014, 2015 with Disney. So it still works. Interestingly, this design predates the Clone Wars by a good bit, but really didn't get a lot of market share until then, when it kind of found a niche. It had been marketed to security forces, police, private militaries, Outer Rim militaries during the Republic era. But yeah, during the Republic, it received orders, and it had pros and cons. And it's a similar size to the AT-RT. It's about 4 meters tall and about 3 meters. Well, I should say it's about 3 meters tall and about 4 meters wide. It's actually a little bit, depending on how the legs situate. These are very articulated legs. It's a little bit slower because it is a little heavier. It's about 60 clicks, but it can actually climb a 40, even 45 degree slope, so that's pretty good. And these legs are more nimble and more maneuverable than you would think. It has twin blasters in the front, and it has a grenade launcher with either a 3 or an 8 round magazine inside. It also has long range comms gear and a sensor package, and it does give some armor protection for the driver. At the same time, he does have a large viewport in front, so that's good. Now, the armor is really only proof against blaster fire, maybe a light laser, but it's better than the RT, a little more improved. And this would fill a similar role, although it's more geared towards patrol, say of a base or installation, than it is a true scout, although it definitely could be used as a scout. And it was used as more light to medium cavalry to get out there and support the infantry. And it was really the first step in the whole AT line, and they were learning. Some stuff was good about it, that they liked at least, like they seemed to like the leg system. On the other hand, the hatch was on the side. The problem is, if it did fall over or otherwise it was blocked, the driver had a bit of a time getting out, so they would learn from that, moving to a top hatch later. Typically it only carried one, but it had just enough room inside for emergency carriage of one extra person, one passenger, so that's another benefit it had over the RT. It also could carry a little more cargo, about 150 kilograms, so it could either bring more supplies to the field, or it could stay out in the field a little bit longer, food, water for the driver, so a little bit longer range, all things told. We don't really see this in the films. It is kind of still a little bit beta canon, although, again, it has been considered officially canon by Disney too. But I like it, and it just kind of shows that early Walker. It's also said that these were still in use by the time of Hoth and the Empire, so this was kind of the smallest version, even smaller than the AT-ST, but quite a bit of use in the Clone Wars, and it proved the whole Walker concept from that point forward. And actually, it would directly inspire our next today. Directly inspired and influenced by the AT-RT and AT-PT, we come to the AT-AP, All-Terrain Artillery Pod, often known as a pod walker, and frequently nicknamed the Sniper Pod. Interesting vehicle. This came about, midway through the Clone Wars, and would see pretty heavy use through the end and much into the Empire. In fact, this would be one of the few that was produced during the Empire. And we don't have one from De Agostini, but we do have the titanium here. Like a lot of the walkers, it just comes with a base and comes off. But it's pretty neat. In fact, I'll probably just hold this one. Might be easier. Get the spinny thing out of our way because we have some parts to move. Overall, we're over 15 meters long, including the big gun, and nearly 11 meters tall. We have two main legs, walker legs, and we have a third leg that is optional / retractable. You can actually see it on this. It moves. That's pretty neat. We can actually fold it all the way up if we want and make it stand on two. See? And this third leg had two purposes. One, to help it on rougher, more uneven terrain, or to help stabilize it when it was firing the big gun, which we will get to. Inside we have two people, a driver and a main gunner, and on top, popping out of this open turret, we have a secondary gunner. And he is manning a medium laser cannon that is designed for anti-vehicle work. And on the bottom, that can be controlled by any guy inside, we have a light dual blaster cannon. Maybe it's a single, I can't remember. Either way, this is rapid fire repeater meant for anti-infantry work. I don't remember if this one moves on here. No, it doesn't. We have reasonably good armor, and we have a reasonably good top speed of about 60 clicks. But the big deal is the big gun here. And it does move on this, which is pretty nifty. Doesn't have full range of motion, nor would it. This is a mass driver, not a laser. It actually fires a solid slug of durasteel or other material at hypersonic speeds. This is an artillery piece. To that end, there's a lot of focus on its systems, targeting systems, sensor systems, terrain mapping systems, and also it is stabilized as much as possible and was known for being a very stable platform. Therefore, it was able to fire over long range. By the way, our top guy does move too. A lot of articulation on this one. Hence the sniper pod designation. And this really would fill an important gap we haven't really seen in Star Wars before, and really somewhat since. Long-range artillery delivering a solid slug instead of laser fire, which there's plenty of instances where that would be called for. And I do like that it has its defensive guns against infantry and other vehicles, and of course its very good top speed. Quite an advanced craft. Like I said, came into use around 21 BBY in the middle of the Clone Wars. Saw heavy use in Felucia, the Outer Rim sieges, and would be supported by other walkers and infantry because of its obviously important role in long range. It would continue at Kuwat, who designed and produced it, into the Empire. They typically use their older facilities to build these, and they were still very much in use when the Galactic Civil War kicked off, and the Rebellion had several themselves. They would often pull off the bottom blaster, and they would often update the sensors and other equipment for the main gun, maybe even sometimes replacing the main gun. They had several during the first Battle of Yavin and the Battle of Tatooine, and the Empire would continue to deploy these alongside the AT-AT and AT-ST, again because they're still kind of fulfilling a separate, different, independent role. These would even go on to inspire the First Order with some of its vehicles later on. But yeah, it's kind of one of my favorites. It's interesting looking. It actually resembles a bit of the AT-TE that we'll get to shortly. But it's just different little tripod system. Like a lot of these, this is created for Revenge of the Sith because George Lucas, generally speaking, wanted to diversify and expand the clone ground forces. And they did just that. Next up, another craft that debuted with Revenge of the Sith, the AT-OT, All-Terrain Open Transport, very literally named. This was introduced during the Clone War to transport a number of clones rapidly to where they might be needed, but it was a second line kind of behind the lines transport. This was not a front lines craft. This was not an attack craft. This was a transport. And that's actually why it's an open top. The idea was that it could carry stuff, materiel, instead of troops if needed. Pull out the seats and do that. They also did make an optional top for it. And it very much reminds me of a Soviet or APC or, BRT. It has a total of 8 legs, and it has a quite good top speed of about 55 clicks, and it can go over quite a few bits of terrain. It's about 14.5 meters long, very low to the ground, so good stability. One nice thing, it only needs one crew, one pilot, so it doesn't require a lot of that. And in the back, it can carry 34 seated clones, plus 25 more if they want to stand, so a total of 60 including the driver. It has light armor on the sides that's proof against blaster fire, but let's be real, that's just not what it's for. If this thing's getting into combat, something's already gone wrong. This is, like I said, from De Agostini. Very nice. And we have one here, too, from the Titanium series. I wish this had troopers in the back, but I guess they wanted to show the seats. Crew compartment in front for the one driver. He does get some more protection. We have a ramp in the back. Kind of wish the ramp was articulated. That'd be neat. But it's not. On the other hand, this is all metal, at least the top part. The legs are plastic, but they do move, which is neat, independently. And we see the weaponry. It's just for defense. In the front, we have 2 medium lasers that could punch through light vehicle armor. And in the back, they could be manned by clones. We have 2 light lasers, anti-personnel. So at least it does have some defense. It's not just completely a sitting duck. But they're fast, relatively lightweight. You can get several on a transport. They weren't hugely expensive to produce, so they worked well for transporting 60 clones where they needed to go total. Just kind of a nice little background ship. You can see them walking over. In the real world, it was just another vessel, another vehicle, and it also showed the clones, which is good for cinematic reasons. Even I know that. I don't know why, it's just kind of one of my favorites. Maybe because it's just so anachronistic that you can tell that they're having a lot of fun with it. Something different, and I love the multi-leg thing. Kind of reminds me of a caterpillar or something. But both are pretty cool from either company. Obviously more detail with the De Agostini, but you do get articulation and less fragility with the titanium. Well, now we're really moving on to the big boys. We return to Rathana Heavy Engineering, although to be fair at this point, it's actually owned or controlled by Kuwait. But anyway, their design for the AT-TE, the All-Terrain Tactical Enforcer. Truly the predecessor of the AT-AT, the AT-AT. This was classed as a tank, as a walker, mobile artillery piece, a bit of a jack of all trades, but still it managed to master them too. And it was just primary throughout the Clone Wars. If it wasn't in service at the Battle of Geonosis, it was in service very soon in 22 BBY. These were used for large engagements, small rescue operations. They were very versatile. And it's our largest craft so far at 22 meters long. Counting the main gun, we're at about 9.5 meters tall, so not terribly. If you don't count it, just kind of going down to the main body, we're at about 6 meters. So we're pretty low and long, which is good for stability. We have 6 legs. Not only do these have terrain sensors, terrain mapping ability, but they can even be magnetized to climb metal surfaces, not to mention very inclined shear surfaces. And we have some pretty good armor. It's proof against light, medium blaster, even some heavier shots. It has ability to disperse heat, although it's not proof against heavy rockets, tank busters, that kind of thing. It even has some types of shielding, including against EMP and ion cannon. The trade-off is it's a little slow, about 60 kmh, so not too bad, but not the fastest. And this drive system is pretty complicated, so if it does get damaged, it could break down in the field. And we actually have 2 compartments, a forward and a back. Each can house units we'll talk about in a minute. And very famous craft from the Clone Wars. In fact, it was one of these that Commander Cody used to try to assassinate Obi-Wan Kenobi, unsuccessfully obviously, but yeah. And it would continue on in the Empire for a few years, and even a few were kind of in backwater or defensive service by the time of the Galactic Civil War, but by that point its days were over. On the other hand, the Rebellion actually captured several and would rework them, giving them heavier armor, different guns, kind of using them as transport. We see this quite a bit in the Clone Wars and other media. And this is the De Agostini. Let's look at the one from the Titanium and talk about some features. One interesting thing, it actually does peg onto its base, unlike a lot of the others. So, this is a tank. What's it armed with? Well, its main gun is this mass driver here that can fold out, rotate on a turret, much like the AT-AP, which this is a heavy version of, even though it actually predates it a bit. It can deliver solid slugs. It was intended to bombard fixed positions, fortifications, but actually its rate of fire and targeting systems are good enough that it can shoot down some slow flying craft like gunships, and even incoming fire from, say, rockets if it's a little bit on the lucky side. In addition to that, it has a total of 6 turrets with medium lasers. You've got 4 in the front and 2 in the back. And that's primarily for defense, either against vehicles or infantry. Has a crew of 7. You have a pilot / driver in the front. In the same compartment, you have a gun spotter, target caller, and he works closely with the 3rd member that's in this top turret. Those are your 3 main crew, and then you have 4 crew that serve as the turret gunners. 2 in the back, 1 for each turret, and 2 in the front, 1 guy for each 2 turrets. They use remote systems to guide those. Also inside, we have 2 troop compartments. Each can carry 10 men, or 1 squad, 1 in the front and 1 in the back. This is kind of interesting because it's kind of a segmented body. There's a flexible connector, so it can move around, actually pivot a bit, kind of making up for its overall length. So 10 in front, 10 in back. Alternatively, it's modular. The rear can be replaced with a command center or command post. So you can still have 10 troopers in the front and then generals and commanders in the back. Or you can carry vehicles in the back, including several AT-RTs, another small craft. And finally, a medical droid is standard on board here for treating the wounded. So it's a pretty versatile, well-appointed craft, and it would make sense why this was so common. You've got an artillery piece built on, you've got defensive turrets, you can carry a number of troopers, light vehicles, commanders. So it does a little bit of everything, but you can also see why specialized vehicles like the AT-AP, AT-OT could be called for. Nevertheless, it's one of the most iconic vehicles of the Clone Wars and would directly inspire the AT-AT later. I should point out that years later, Rex and his cohorts were living on one of these a couple of years before the rebellion got hot, and they did go up against AT-ATs, and while their mass driver was quite decent, it was not able to punch through the AT-AT's primary hull armor. So it's a reasonably powerful gun, but probably not as powerful as some others. But quintessential part of the clone army, wouldn't you say? Well, let's move along, kind of get away from walkers for a minute and get to some repulsor craft again, kind of where we started. And the award for most different looking craft goes to the UT-AT, Unstable Terrain Artillery Transport, often nicknamed the Trident because of its 3-gun front structure. And you might think this is a beta canon thing or secondary, but no, it was actually seen in Revenge of the Sith as part of the expansion of the clone forces. In universe, it's said that while the AT-TE was good and useful, it was heavy and long, and so in certain areas it would collapse the terrain, including places that had light bridges or bridge-type structures, causeways. So, kind of seeing a need, Kuwat partnered with Makun, who had a lot of experience with repulsor craft, to design this guy, the UT-AT. And it was meant to be a multi-purpose craft, but primarily an artillery vehicle. So it was introduced a little after the AT-TE, midway in the Clone Wars. It's a little bit longer, at nearly 24 meters, but it's very flat, very short. And you notice it doesn't have any legs, any feet. It actually has 16 low-power repulsor pads, each that can move and work independently on the sides. Plus it has 4 higher-power repulsor pads underneath that are there to generate thrust. It only has a top speed of about 45 clicks, so pretty much the slowest one to date, but it doesn't put direct pressure on the ground. What pressure it does push is even and spread out quite a bit. So it can cross unstable areas, snow, mud, muck, and lighter bridges that a heavier walker would just thump on. The trade-off was it was, pretty slow. Also, because it was hovering above the ground, it was vulnerable underneath to mines and things. There were sensors and stuff to try to minimize this, but there's only so much they could do. Anywho, had a crew of 6. You had a driver and 5 gunners. Essentially, there was a front gunner and then 4 rear-facing gunners. The rear guns were defensive lasers, and the front were a little diverse. You had 2 medium laser cannon, and then you had one effectively artillery piece, which was a turbo laser. So instead of being a mass driver, as on other artillery we've seen today, it was a turbo laser, which kind of goes along with the lighter weight and what have you. And if it needed to really settle in for stability for long-range shots, the repulsors could kind of reverse and suck it into the ground and really stick it to the ground real stable-like. Additionally, it was kind of a cargo sled. Towards the front, it could carry up to 20 troops, so similar to the AT-TE. So it could work as a carrier as well. Makes perfect sense. Another alternative role, it could serve as a construction vehicle, namely a bridge layer, so they could strip off some equipment and put on bridge laying equipment, and in that case it would carry engineers in the back. Kind of interesting. Makes kind of sense that this could go ahead, lay a bridge for AT-TEs to travel, which were better armored and a little more durable. Neat craft though, but we only see this in the De Agostini series, and it's a pretty kind of background vehicle. Nevertheless, we actually do see it on, I think it's Felucia, and it's used in the Outer Rim sieges. I don't think it was ever produced in huge numbers. It is definitely a specialist craft, and it definitely has compromises to make other things work out, but that's okay. And I don't think I've ever shown you this one before. It is different looking. When this was created in the real world, it was briefly called the Altering Cargo Sled, ATCS, but they eventually settled on the name UT-AT. So what do you think? A repulsor craft. And next, we're going to change gears a bit, but still kind of in the same general category. This is one I was looking for quite a while and picked up last year and did its own video on, but it's included here because it fits. Just as Kuwat had identified a need with the UT-AT, Rathana identified another need and developed the TX-130, so-called saber tank, or fighter tank, or Republic assault tank. This is a repulsor craft, almost like a ground-based version of a starfighter. Now, the De Agostini collection does not feature this, so we only have our titanium here, and this isn't a very common one in and of that. Relatively small and compact. We have a main cabin here that seats 2 tandem. Basically, you have 2 pilots, and you have a commander and a gunner. This is pretty well armed. We have 2 heavy laser cannon that can have limited movement, limited motion for attacking air or ground targets. And on top of that, we have a flexible turret here. The turret itself is optional. It has its own little gunner, and it can have a blaster, or it can have a beam weapon, what have you. And on top of all that, we have 2 light ordnance launchers, one at each kind of sponson here. Total crew is 4. It can carry 2 passengers if needed, and it can support an astromech droid if the mission calls for it. It is a repulsor craft with an engine on the back too for speed. It's said to be quick and maneuverable. It also can fly quite high, about 10 meters off the ground, which gives it some flexibility. It only has light armor against small blaster fire, but it does have shielding. It's one of the few that is shielded, so that kind of makes up for it, that plus its speed. And it's designed as kind of medium to heavy cavalry, infantry support, escort, rapid response, anti-armor, anti-infantry, that kind of role. Again, it is kind of like a starfighter, but ground-based. And these are typically operate in groups, either squadrons, small groups, or platoons, large groups. So something you typically didn't see independent. But yeah, another repulsor craft like the UTAT and the Swamp Speeder we saw earlier and the Bark Speeder, but just a little bit heavier. And this would be used typically to support walkers and infantry. We first see this in the Clone Wars video game, also the Empire War video game, and the original Battlefront and Battlefront 2. And it does appear in the novelization of Revenge of the Sith and is nominally canon because it appears in source material. Just neat though. Like a lot of the later Titanium series, because this came out very late in the collection, it's somewhat lighter. The top is metal, but the bottom is plastic. I'm sure if it had come out earlier, it would be a chunky thing, but at least we do have moving parts. We have a moving turret and moving guns. And I think it fits in well with the clone army. These were well liked and well respected. And in fact, they continued on into the Empire for quite some time, although the version the Empire used was a little different than the clone version here. And with that, we're down to our final entry. Designed by Kuat, this is the HAVW, Heavy Assault Vehicle Wheeled A6. Part of the Juggernaut family, replacing the older A5. This is pretty much the biggest ground vehicle the clones used during the war. Twice the size of the ATTE. It's just a hair under 50 meters long. And it's pretty much our only wheeled vehicle. We have a set of 10 wheels. And each can pretty much move independently, at least in drive pairs, and they're all powered by a very high output generator reactor system. Yeah, there's a lot here to this, and you'd think because of its size it'd be slow, but it's not. At least in a straight line on the right surface, it can get up to 160 clicks, mostly thanks to the high output systems. It has heavy armor, and it's just massive. It has 2 decks internally, and a standard crew of 12, pilot, co-pilot, vehicle commander, engineer, navigator, comms officer, and 6 technicians. On top of that, it can employ 8 secondary gunners from the cargo, essentially, because it can carry up to 300 troopers and their equipment, meaning this is definitely our biggest carrier. It can also carry small vehicles and even some not so small. Whereas the ATTE had a medical droid on board, this has an actual medical facility, medical suite. Small one, but it's there. And it actually has 2 command facilities, one on each end, a primary and a backup in case the first one gets knocked out. It can also reverse and drive in either direction, kind of locomotive style. And we have a lot of armament. One thing I want to point out before we move on, it does have this here, which is a retractable pod for observing the battlefield. Kind of neat. And on top we have 2 main types of gun. There's one repeating laser cannon and a turret. And then there's also a heavy laser cannon that can act as a artillery piece. On top of that, we have retractable ordnance launchers, mostly meant for anti-infantry. There's 2 of those. There's 2 medium lasers and a set of twin, so a total of 4 anti-personnel lasers as well. That plus the armor means we're well protected in here. And it's just a very versatile thing. It's got a very cavernous interior. Can be configured for different roles. These are often used as command posts, but also obviously troop transports, and hence their name of clone tank. They were used as tanks, and they were considered very fast, hence the name turbo tank. They have a lot of names. And were introduced relatively early in the Clone Wars. They were first seen with the first Battle of Fallujah. So that was, what, 22 or early 21 BBY? And would it surprise you to learn, we see it in canon for the first time with the Revenge of the Sith, Episode 3. So that was the D'Agostini. Here is the titanium. This was one of the older original titaniums, so it is mostly metal. The front wheels and the rear move, the middle ones don't. On the other hand, this turret does move, but the other does not. I don't think. No, yeah, it doesn't. And it doesn't have the extended pod. It's okay. It's a little small. Some of the early ones are either big hits or big misses with this, and I'm not going to say it's a fail, but now this is the kind of snowy version that comes with the base. The first variant had no base at all. It's okay. But I would definitely say for this one, the D'Agostini is superior. But yeah, twice the size of a ATTE. This it's basically a mobile battery. It basically has the whole firepower of a platoon or even brigade. It's just it's a beast. But not invulnerable because it's still on the ground. Typically you'd see these escorted by other walkers or vehicles, because there's a lot of assets in these, and they're not inexpensive to produce, and because of the drive system and reactor, they are a little complex. They are well armored, but if they are damaged, they can go out a little easily. But yeah, our only wheeled vehicle, definitely giving a lot of variety to the clones here. What do you think? Which ones do you like best? Let's wrap this up. And we end where we began. What do you think? I think the thing for the prequels, you might argue about plot or dialogue, but the vehicles and the, imagination of the combat was quite interesting. There were space battles, but it just seems like when you think Clone Wars, you think of the ground battles between the Separatist Droid Army and the Grand Army of the Republic Clone Army. Maybe that's just me. So a lot of these are pretty iconic. I have a soft spot for the AT-OT. I don't know why. It really reminds me of an old military truck. But there's a lot to be said for the Juggernauts and AT-TEs as well. I kind of wish that Titanium did a BARC speeder. Not really sure why they didn't. Oh well. But I don't know. Just felt like revisiting today. So I hope you enjoyed. And yeah, we'll maybe do the Empire next, or who knows. Let me know what you'd like to see, though. Maybe in the comments. Give me any ideas. That'd be great. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.